Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Austere Academy, Book the Fifth by Lemony Snicket. So, I have thoughts about this one. I'll start with simple thoughts of I should have picked this book up at a different moment. I was already in a slightly heavier mood emotionally, and this was too sad of a book for the moment. Or maybe I should say, too austere of a book for the moment. Lol. But no, really, this is a really good book. I just wasn't in the mood for it. So let's see if I can work through my mood to actually talk about the contents of the book and not how I emotionally felt about it in that moment. So The Austere Academy is the fifth book in the series of Unfortunate Events books. The Baudelaire children are now being placed in a boarding school, which honestly should be a good thing for them. They're smart kids, they'll be around other kids, they'll be safe from Count Olaf, who is still pursuing them in an attempt to steal their fortune. After all, the school has an advanced computer system that can protect them. But of course, this isn't called a series of fortunate events. It turns out that the school, Proof Preparatory Academy, isn't a great school. The vice principal is an arrogant man who cannot play the violin, but insists on doing so. The teachers failed to get even the education-hungry Baudelaires interested in their lessons, and Sunny, the baby, doesn't even get to go to class. Instead, she has to work as a secretary, which is a perfectly valid job for a baby. I don't know what you're talking about. And they have to live in the orphan shack because they don't have parents to sign their permission slip for them to live in the dorms. But at least Count Olaf isn't there. Until the new gym teacher arrives. Will the Baudelaires be able to survive this new, awful placement? Of course, it's a middle grade book, they will survive. But first, I know my mood here heavily affected my ability to enjoy reading this book. I knew I should have put this book down and picked up a different book because when I got to the inevitable moment when Count Olaf arrives, I just felt this sense of dread that was significantly more serious than the book should call for. And so much of these books are about a feeling of helplessness. And specifically the feeling of helplessness that kids feel. How they often feel like they can see dangers that the adults can't see. And that the adults seem to be ignoring. How often they feel like the adults around them are a combination of incompetent and cruel. How often rules feel arbitrary and draconian. And how often kids feel ignored and forgotten. And that's a valid thing for a kid's book to offer catharsis for. But for me, at least, there's a very narrow line between catharsis and wallowing in a feeling. And it's one of those lines that is going to move for every person. Every single person that reads something or sees a movie or sees music even will find this line in a different place. And for me, at least, that line moves depending on what mood I'm in. And so sometimes, yeah, I am in the mood for books like Series of Unfortunate Events. But for me, it's a very narrow window where the series walks the line of catharsis and doesn't tip into wallowing. But I know most people don't feel that way about it. My sister absolutely loves this series, possibly more than any other series. And she's got good taste. And I know she's not alone in this because the Netflix show got a lot of views. But the important thing is, for me, when I picked this book up, I wasn't in the place for the line to hit exactly right. And so I did read this book in 2 sittings, but that's just because I wanted to be done with it and move on. I will also say that I do remember when I first read this series, which is a while ago. I think I was fresh out of college. But the first time I read it, it was when I got to this book that I was beginning to really get to the feeling of, okay, we've done the same pattern. Can we move on? Because yeah, the first half of the series is all of the books have the exact same plot pattern. The Baudelaires get placed with a new guardian. There is someone likable but flawed who is either their guardian or just in a position to help them. Olaf arrives in disguise. They recognize him and try to tell an adult. The adult tells them that they are wrong and invites Olaf further into their lives. Olaf enacts his plan to separate the kids from their guardian. Violet invents something, Klaus does research, and Sunny bites something. And they manage to reveal Olaf, who flees, and the kids are taken away to their next placement. And that's fine. I am 100% behind episodic books, and a lot of episodic stories do tend to have a very similar pattern to the stories. Especially like TV shows. Think about like the 7 million episodes of Law and Order. They all have the exact same pattern of a story. And like there are a lot of stories that can follow the same pattern and every single time feel fresh, feel like it's doing something new with it, feel like it's bringing new themes, new elements, and just being a new book. But these stories are simple enough that by this point in the series, both this time and the last time I read it, I was just desperately craving something different, and I think I wouldn't be craving it so much if it weren't for the fact that I knew, even the first time I read it, by the point I got to this book, I knew that the kids were getting really close to the point that they do break out of the cycle. And I just knew it was coming, and this time reading it, it's very, very clear to me. I know that I have one more book in this pattern, and then we go to a completely different pattern where they do completely different things, and I just keep feeling myself going, okay, I got it. When do we get to the next proverbial chapter? Though I do want to say that one thing I noticed on this read-through is that the books actually start cracking the mold little by little a lot earlier than I remember. Like, in this one in particular, the kids make the choice to not reveal that they recognize Olaf immediately. They are trying to do something new. And really the last one and the one before it both had elements that sort of broke the mold just a little bit to give you that feeling of, okay, we're getting somewhere, they're evolving, they're changing, something is happening. And like in this one, there are more and more mentions that the kids are just wishing they could run away and rely on themselves. And this buildup is both part of what made me as a reader itch for the story to find a new pattern, but it's also what makes the eventual choice the kids make to not rely on the system anymore and to seriously just run off on their own. It makes it feel more earned, more logical, more viable, and more understandable. And one thing I think is easy to say about this series of books is they are a textbook for foreshadowing. And first instinct is to say, yeah, it's very simple, very straightforward. This is gonna be like foreshadowing 101. And what I love here is, yeah, there is a lot of foreshadowing that is in your face, aggressively blatant, super present. It's the narrator literally starting each and every book telling us that you won't be happy reading this book because the Baudelaires are going to have a terrible time. It's the random moments when the narrator literally pauses the story to tell us we can still stop reading before X character dies. It's the moments when the narrator says something like, the children made these assumptions, but not all assumptions are correct. But there's also a good bit of more subtle foreshadowing embedded in this one. Like, one thing I noticed in this read-through is that there are moments in all the books when the narrator's personal story sneaks in. That is an element of the entire series, and almost all of it centers around Beatrice. We get dedications for Beatrice. We get the mournful one-liners about his lost love. We get just analogies that are like, okay, they're doing this, which is like when I lost Beatrice. But this is the first one, at least I remember, that the narrator's personal story, it becomes really obvious that it will interact with the Baudelaire story. That it's not unrelated. That it's not just him, you know, thinking about her because she's always on his mind, because the Baudelaire's loss of their parents reminds him of his lost love. But no, Beatrice's story directly does interact with the Baudelaires. And there's also the cut-off mention of the Baudelaire's hometown that the Quagmire triplets make when they are talking about their research on Count Olaf. There's the one mention of VFD, which is not at all subtle. That one is very in your face. But there's so many seeds planted in this book for the later half of the series that honestly I had forgotten were there. My memory was that it wasn't until they separate from the system that you really start figuring out what the hell is happening in the series. But I do want to talk some more specific things about this book in particular. Like, I really love the fact that in this one in particular, I noticed that Sunny's language is sort of evolving. And this honestly might be one of those things I just did not notice in the earlier books. But a lot of her nonsense words in this book are actually words. And they do have, you know, meaning connected to what the story is doing at that moment. Like, the first time I noticed it in this one, Sunny is introduced to Isadora Quagmire, who is an aspiring poet. And the baby says the word Sappho, which does honestly sound like the kind of random syllables that babies make, but it's also Sappho, the famous female poet. Also, the famous lesbian poet, which made me wonder, does Sunny, like, have a really good gaydar? Is Isadora gay? We don't know. But there's also the moment when Violet is thanking Sunny, and the baby responds, "De nada." And I loved that, particularly because my sister, who absolutely loves these books and who introduced me to these books, says "de nada" all the time. And now I have to wonder, was she just speaking Spanish because she happened to know the Spanish for "you're welcome," or was she quoting a baby? But there's also a couple of other moments here where the words just actually do have meaning. And I really like this, both because it's funny, but also because Sunny grows more than any other character in the entire series, which is natural. Sunny is a baby. She starts this series barely able to crawl and ends up toddling, because babies grow really quickly. But the evolution of her language from just random syllables into something with meaning is used really well to start planting the seeds, because also that is one of those things that we don't see a lot in the early books, because also the early books happen relatively quick together. We don't see how much the kids are growing up, and by the end, if my memory serves, like more than a year has passed by the end of the books. So yeah, the kids do grow. I also want to talk about the setting in this one, because in my mind, I always want to put this book earlier on in the series, and specifically because a boarding school would be so much higher in the list of places to send orphans than, for example, a lumber mill. And it's just such an obvious choice in many ways. And I feel like the story does lean into the obvious choices, the cliches about boarding schools, the tropes. We've got the cruel popular girl who the admin likes for some unknown reason. We've got a not great cafeteria. We've got the terrible dormitory. We've got the cruel dictatorial admin and boring classes. But of course, this is Lemony Snicket, so it's weird, there are twists, there's exaggerations. Many of the things are cranked up past 11 on to like 12 and 13. Like, the orphan shack is not just, like, you know, a drafty place that's infested with bugs and where the kids are crowded in too tightly or something, but no, it is a literal shack infested with crabs and mold. But there's also some that is a little bit of a subversion or a nod to the trope. Like the idea of Carmelita Spatz. She is set up as a major secondary antagonist. And in most books set in a boarding school, yeah, the mean girl will be, or at least the mean kid, will be the major secondary antagonist. And hell, like, it's such a solid trope that I remembered her being a much more important character in this. I remembered scenes that just aren't in the book, and I'm assuming that I transposed them from other books set in boarding schools. She's barely in here. She's a background color character, like literally just there to paint the picture of a boarding school. Beyond calling them ridiculous insults, her only real input in the plot is delivering messages. She doesn't tattle on them to get them in trouble, which is one of those scenes I literally remembered happening, and it's literally just not in the book. But also, they don't really have any fights, and in the end we find out the teachers don't actually like her. And it's just an interesting, like, introduction of the trope, and then it's sort of just swept out from under us. And I will admit, that's one of those things I did not notice in the first read, and I noticed it now. But also, like the cafeteria, it isn't awful because the food is nasty, which is traditional. No, it's awful because most of the school's punishments revolve around denying kids silverware and glasses, and that is a very Lemony Snicket kind of twist. Also, the dictatorial admin is literally named Nero. He likes to fiddle, and he's a vice principal. And I sort of really love that he's a vice principal. We literally never meet or hear of the existence of the principal. It's just the vice principal. And there's something just beautifully ridiculous about this man who is childish and petty and a tyrant. And he's the second in command when we never actually see the actual primary ruler here. It's really well done. I also want to say that this book is funny. Like, even though I was in a rather melancholy mood while reading it, I still laughed out loud several times. And I love that in particular because, for me, the shots of humor tilt us a little bit closer to catharsis and away from wallowing. It allows that break of tension that doesn't make it feel samey, and also just makes it more physically pleasant to read. And in contrast to the humor, I also feel like this book was the first one where we get some really deeply honest moments of real mourning in these books. Like, this one features a scene where the Baudelaires are remembering a disastrous picnic they had with their parents not long before their parents' death. And it's a gentle, beautiful, painful kind of memory. And I really appreciate the fact that this is one of those moments where the book also allows us to bring a little bit more hopeful tone into the story. This is a moment when we get to see their memories. We get to feel the loss, the hole in their lives. And the narrator tells us how they think they might go back to that spot again. And then we get a gut punch at the end of the scene. And it's just all these emotions. It's very beautifully done. Similarly, this book made me straight up cry when the kids are having what is a relatively peaceful, almost pleasant evening. And it's not great, like there are still problems going on, but there's just this really gentle moment, and the narrator directly says he's going to pause here. Let the kids have this moment, because when things are hard, we really need to just accept the moments that are good. Even if they might not seem to be the greatest moments from the outside, even if we know that there's going to be bad before and after, even if there's still a lot of fear and pain, when we have the happy moments, we have to accept that happiness. And all that was beautiful and cathartic and emotional in the best way. And it's healing. I also want to briefly talk about the Quagmire triplets. They make their first appearance here in this book, and they are really interesting characters. They are basically foils for the Baudelaires, and they are really interesting foils because in many ways they have an easier time of it than our main characters. But here, they are sort of mirrors to show us how the Baudelaires have been forced to change. Duncan and Isadora's trust, optimism, belief in their own ability is where the Baudelaires were at the beginning of this series. And, ironically, at least from what I can understand of the timeline, Isadora and Duncan lost their family significantly before the Baudelaires lost theirs. And the difference is just they've been in one relatively safe place ever since then, whereas the Baudelaires have been forced to move on. And so the Isadora and Duncan have yet to learn how bad things really are. And there's just this beautiful tragedy of seeing their trust and their optimism next to the distrust and the struggle to hope that we see in our main characters. And it is very much a therefore but the grace of God go we kind of moment. And they are another way for us and the Baudelaires to see how our protagonists are more and more ready to strike out on their own. And in the end, the reason I find these books sometimes too heavy for me is the exact same reason I think they are brilliant and absolutely necessary. Yes, they are silly little books that really commit to the joke that kids want stories that aren't all happiness and gentleness and hugs and kisses. But they are also deeply powerful books about overcoming trauma, adultification of kids who are being abused, the tragedy of children being failed by society, about how sometimes a childhood is something that has to be survived, not enjoyed, about trusting your instincts about people even when no one else believes you, and about how sometimes all you can do is cling to those you love and ride out the storm. And those are really important messages. I know there are a lot of kids who need those messages. There are kids who will see themselves in the Baudelaires and who need to see these kids having their wins, no matter how small these wins are, and all that. But these are books that just remind me how much we need them, and that itself hurts. The fact that there are kids suffering from significantly less silly versions of what's happening in these books. That there are petty tyrants who will see you as nothing but a waste of time. That there are times when the only people who can see someone as evil are the ones who have no power to do anything about it. That sometimes the best win you can hope for is survival. And I just want a world where these books don't feel so relevant.